two aspects, I think, when it comes to evaluating the extractive industries. There's the one which we've already heard from Sam about, which is the analytical approach. When you look at costs, when you look at management, when you look at location and all those physical factors. The other aspect which nobody really considers is what actually happens to the medium of exchange that you price things in. We live in a world of credit, not money, credit. I'll explain that a bit more in a moment. But I have to say that probably the most important point when it comes to looking at extractive industries is to disregard the Western alliance, the old world, us. We're turning our backs on fossil fuels. Yet something like a military man told me that 98% of logistics is powered by fossil fuels, mainly diesel. How can we turn our back on it? We've got this sort of determination to do away with energy, which is central to absolutely everything. But that is the reality of the situation, and this undoubtedly has helped push the Saudis towards the Asian hegemons, the Asian axis, where they are now doing deals, not in petrodollars, but in yuan. They're now calling it the petro-yuan. So we're getting a divide, I think, in the world, which is so far not really being understood in the Western media. But this is going to be extremely important in the future. So what are the Asian hegemons doing? Well, they're cornering resources to an extent. They are cornering resources not only within Asia, but also in Africa and Latin America, South America, Central America to a degree. And we have a situation where the plan, basically, is to do away with the dollar. So we're looking at a fundamental change in that respect. And also to do away with allied Western currencies. The important point behind this is that they have a plan. Now, I don't like state-induced plans, but they have a plan. And what they want to do is they want to bring about an industrial revolution throughout the Asian membership, which these two head up. We're talking about the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. We're talking about BRICS, and now we call it BRICS Plus. Saudis are said to be joining this year. And also we're talking about the Eurasian Economic Union, and the Eurasian Economic Union under the committee of it under the leadership of Sergei Glaziev, who is a senior Russian economist, is considering the construction of a replacement trade currency so they do not need to use the dollar. Now we're going to find out about this, I think, in the coming weeks, maybe months, particularly as our banking system comes under strains. And I think it's very important to understand what's going on there. As far as the extractive industries are concerned, it doesn't matter what we do in the West about energy, coal, oil, natural gas, trying to do away with it. It is central to what the Asian hegemons are doing. And this process of industrialization, the new industrial revolution that's going on throughout Asia, involves directly something like 3.8 billion people, almost half the world's population. Now, for comparison, those of us in the declining West, about 1.2 billion. I'm not including the Southeast Asian nations like Thailand, Cambodia, Philippines, and so on, and that, because they're sitting on the fence. I mean, we saw this with Indonesia, the recent G20. They sat on the fence when it came to Western-inspired attempts to blacken Russia's name. So this is a world which is fundamentally changing. And it means that over the long term, the demand for resources, raw materials, commodities, energy is going to continue. And the value on that is going to be greater in the coming decades than it is today. So these extractive industries, whatever they are, whether it's, I don't know, bauxite or gold or food. I mean, it really doesn't matter. There is going to be a lot of demand in the long term. And as token for this, if you look at the Chinese banking system, in all the turmoil we've seen in the last 2 weeks, with share prices of banks in the West collapsing, I note that the share prices of the Chinese GSIBs have actually been rising. It is a different world. We're split into two. So that's so much for the extractive industries. To understand what's going on with the money side or the credit side, I think the first thing we've got to understand is that money doesn't circulate. What does circulate is credit. We've got credit basically in two forms. The central bank credit, which are banknotes evidenced. I don't think I've got one on me at the moment, but we do have banknotes, and in England you'll see that in very small print it says, "I promise to pay the bearer on demand the sum of," it's £10, £20, depending on the note, signed by the chief cashier. And I have to say that the wording has got smaller and smaller and smaller with every iteration of UK banknotes. And that gives us a clue. Money itself, we can define as the circulating medium which has no counterparty risk. When you have it, you're not relying on an obligation from someone else to satisfy it, which is the distinction between credit and money. Money is only one thing, and that's gold. So if I can just quickly take you through some of that. So the legal definition, now this goes all the way back to Roman times. In my next slide, I'll go into a bit more detail on that. But the definition of currency is a circulating medium, whatever that's made up of. And as I've just described, banknotes. Now, bank deposit. When you have money in a bank, you don't actually have money in the bank. The bank has an obligation to you. You have credit. And that credit depends on the credibility of the bank, whether the bank can actually satisfy that demand. So it's important to understand that. Now, the way this works is that bank loans are just created. Bank loans are created out of thin air. It's quite simple. Under double entry bookkeeping, what happens is that when you go into a bank and you say, "I want to borrow £1 million," and the banker agrees that your project is worth financing, lending you £1 million, or dollars, or whatever it might be, then he will ask you to sign the papers. You will sign the papers, and he will say, "Thank you very much indeed. Right, we've now got an agreement, contract between us." And as you go out the door, he'll shake your hand and he'll say, "Your money is now in your account." Now, what he means by that is that he's booked your loan as an asset. But under double entry bookkeeping, he's got to also make an entry on the other side of his balance sheet as a liability. And that liability is the amount of money that's available for you to draw down. Nobody else is involved. This is the creation of money out of thin air in the form of credit. This is the great thing about credit. And credit has actually existed longer than money itself. I mean, if you go back to Phoenician times, the Phoenicians traded between, I suppose, 1500 BC and 1000 BC, well before Rome really got money going, as it were, in the form of coin. They traveled all the way around the Mediterranean, and there is evidence now that they actually got as far as Cornwall, where they obtained tin. Now, these are the days of before really currency and before money. And what was happening was they were using it as barter. But if you were a merchant and you were trying to obtain, say, tin from Cornwall, you obviously had a lot of, I call them, expenses up front. So you had to get promises from people to help you fund the venture. That's called credit. And that's what happened long before the Romans actually invented their form of money in the form of coin, which actually is at the time of the 12 tables, and refined and perfected their law. The 12 tables were produced, I mean, when say 12 tables, it was actually laws written on 12 tablets, and it was a sort of framework, if you like, with sort of very basic, you shouldn't do this, and what you do with slaves, and, what retribution you can have, and so on. And according to one of the jurors, a guy called Gaius, at the time of the 12 tables, was the first issue of Roman coin. So that's when it started in Rome. And it's also, bear in mind, this is the time of Aristotle and just slightly later of Alexander the Great and so on and so forth. So there was a huge, huge intellectual and philosophical revolution going on at the time. It took some considerable time, something like 700 years, before the rulings of two jurors in particular, Alpian and Paulus Ferraris, were sort of put together. And those were the rulings that were put together in Justinian's Pandects, which were issued in 533 AD. Now, that became the basis of Roman law. And it was refined as far as the Eastern Empire was concerned. All this was gathered together in something called the Basilica, under the dynasty, if you like, of Basil I and his son. And so between the two halves of the Roman Empire, we had laws which were going out into the Orthodox Christian world, if you like, Russia and so on and so forth, as far as the steppes and beyond, and in the West into Europe. And of course, we colonized the world. You know, Spain did the New World, Portugal was doing around Africa, also parts of South America, and of course the British Empire we know about, and the Dutch with the Spice Islands. So we spread the basis of our law when it comes to money and credit around the world. Now, a modern monetary system doesn't have money in it at all, money in the sense that it is physical gold. It doesn't figure in the system anymore. So we've got basically credit. It is entirely credit. And the proportion, roughly, is that the ratio of bank credit to bank notes is about 8 times. Now, that includes quite a lot of banknotes which are not in circulation in America. It is estimated that over half the dollar banknotes in circulation are actually outside America. So probably the true ratio of bank credit to notes is something like almost 20 times. Now, the reason this is important is shown in this chart. I mean, this is of oil priced in both gold and dollars. If you go back to 1950, the dollar price of oil was something like $2.57 a barrel. It was a standard price. And that pertained all the way through until the ending of the Bretton Woods system. The Bretton Woods system, which loosely tied the dollar, and therefore even more loosely tied other currencies to gold through the US Treasury's reserves, gold reserves. You can see two things. Once the Bretton Woods system ended, the volatility of the price of oil in dollars became immense. Yet the price in gold grams was pretty stable. And this has got very, very important implications because really on two levels. First of all the volatility being in this fiat currency world, being in the fiat currencies, we should actually be pricing things in gold grams, or certainly energy. And I've also run this test through on commodities, baskets of commodities and so on and so forth. And I get exactly the same result. Huge volatility when you measure these things in paper currencies, but very little volatility when you measure it in gold. And this makes an awful lot of sense, because even if you go back to the time of Diocletian, who was around about third century AD, emperor, he had a collapsing currency, and the reason it was collapsing was because it was so thoroughly debased there was no silver left in the denarius whatsoever. And he did what our governments try and do very often. He tried to stop prices rising by legislating that you could not increase prices by more than a certain amount. He capped all the prices. And he wrote this in stone. So we have prices today which we can compare with then. Now, obviously, things have changed. We don't have slave markets anymore, thank goodness. But when you look at things like food, when you look at things like beer, which was in cities was very much a replacement for water, When you look at clothes and things like that, you find the prices are remarkably similar to those today. And for those of you with an interest in the relationship between gold and silver, you'll be very interested to know that the relationship on Diocletian's edict was actually 12 to 1. And we're into something like 86, 87 to 1 today. So there's something in there. Now, this is very, very important. Also, when you look at things like house prices, I ran this through on London house prices, which go back, I think, on an index to about 1968. And when you look at London house prices in gold, they've actually gone up something like 30% over all that time since 1968. Whereas we know that London house prices and prices of property elsewhere have just gone up, 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 up. All they have done basically is they have reflected the debasement of our currencies. And when it comes to the debasement, this is a log scale. And this is taken from the Nixon shock, when President Nixon temporarily suspended the Bretton Woods Agreement, in other words, permanently. And if you look at those major currencies, sterling has now retained 1% of its value at that time, measured in gold. The dollar, 2%. The euro, about 2.8%. The yen was retained about 5%. Now, this is something which very few people are actually aware of. What they regard as the objective thing in a transaction, money. I mean, we can agree on that money has a particular value. That's the whole point of having money. All the price change, an argument about price is in what we're exchanging. So if I'm selling you something, I'm selling it because I got a surplus of it. You're buying it because you need it, or you want it, or you desire it. We have different reasons for having it. But the one thing we do agree on is accepting pounds or euros or whatever it might be in exchange. And we are completely unaware of what's actually happening to it. And why is this happening? It's the difference between real money, which is gold, silver, has been long before the Romans coined it, and credit. Credit, which is now not anchored to anything whatsoever. And of course, with the dollar, we've gone through these phases. I mean, the Bretton Woods Agreement was set up in 1944, and America basically had huge, huge gold reserves. And under the $35 arrangement, which I think probably underpriced the dollar relative to gold, meant that gold actually flowed to America. So they ended up with huge, huge, great quantities in storage. But then that gradually ran out. Why did it run out? It ran out basically because the Americans printed credit for export. They financed the Korean War, well, first of all, the Second World War to a degree, also Korean War, and then the Vietnam War. And it was the Indochina aspect of it which got so many dollars flooding back into, guess who? France, which used to be the dominant European power in that region. And it led to France leading the selling of dollars in return for gold. And the London gold pool finally failed at the tail end of the 1960s. They tried to put together arrangements to stabilize it. That didn't work. And that was what led to the end of any link. And since then, what we've had is just pure propaganda about why gold is not in the monetary system anymore. Why the gold standard is a barbaric relic, as Keynes put it. Why, more latterly, someone said in America that gold is a pet rock. This is just propaganda. The reality of the situation is that money is gold and silver, physical. Anything else is credit. Everything else is credit. And I think J.P. Morgan himself, the founder of the eponymous bank, made this point way back in 1912, speaking to Congress. Now, what we're seeing, you could see from that previous chart that we've now got currencies which have fallen very substantially. And on top of that, we now have a banking problem. Now, banking problems happen basically every 10 years. We've had something like 15 years since the Lehman crisis. And I call that the Lehman crisis because I think the crisis to come will be the great financial crisis, which everybody attributes to Lehman. So what we've got is actually, and we're beginning to see this, and this is something which is going to change the valuation of our currencies, I think, very, very materially. One of the things that, of course, drives this is what do other people do? And this is where the Asian hegemons, I think, are desperately important. What they're doing is they are coming up with a new trade settlement currency. Now, we haven't had the announcement, but we had an article by Sergei Glaziev writing in a Moscow Business News, which you can Google translate. And that shows this is the man, incidentally, who is behind the new Moscow Gold Exchange proposal. He was extolling the virtues of gold as money. He gets it. So when they do this, if they do this in that very visible form, it will send a message that currency valuations are going to be based on gold or possibly, at the very, very least, commodities. And that leaves us with naked fiat. Now, the point about credit is, what is credit? Credit depends entirely on the confidence in it. It's not really got anything to do with the quantities. I mean, yes, if you double the quantity of circulating medium, if I can put it that way, then obviously you're going to affect its purchasing power. I don't think anyone argues against that. But how it is actually valued, it's valued in the hands of the people who have that credit or who count that credit as an asset in their wealth, in its exchangeability. And once that confidence goes, there is nothing the issuer of banknotes, the central bank, can actually do to stop it. And this was actually, I mean, we've seen this so many times in history, and it's a terribly important point, not to be underestimated. I mean, the sort of thing, I'm going to just go on one here. This illustrates, I think, pretty graphically what's going on. Why do we have interest rates having broken this long-term downtrend? I mean, the answer basically is you've got to understand what an interest rate is. It's not what the central bank says. It's not the price of money, which is basically what they believe. No, it's the compensation that you seek for holding that credit. You are denying yourself that the use of money, the use of the credit which represents money for a period of time. So what you're going to have is you're going to have a factor, a discount, if you like, future value because of loss of use of that credit. You've also got counterparty risk, and you've got a third factor which is really coming into play, and that is when I get my money back, say having loaned it to someone for a year, what is it going to buy? You need compensation for that. So what interest rates are not the price of money in that sense. I mean, it is to a businessman because he uses it in his business calculations. But as far as depositors are concerned, it is desperately important that you get the return on the money or the credit that you've provided to someone else, which compensates you for what you think is being lost. That's actually what it is. So we have now a situation where we've got interest rates, according to the central banks, base rates running up to about 5% roughly. Yet in this country, we had inflation came through for the last month at 10.4%. And if you look at the retail price index, it's something like 15%. Where is the compensation? It is not there. And this is particularly important as far as foreign owners of a currency are concerned. A foreign owner of a currency cannot be corralled into accepting a loss on his deposits. He can just sell the currency. Point about the dollar is that financial assets owned by foreigners, according to the US Treasury's own figures, total roughly $30 trillion. That's more than US GDP. Of that, roughly $7 trillion is in bank deposits and short-term bills, if you like. So less than 1 year. So that money is footloose and fancy free. That can go. And this brings us back to the point, what's being planned in Asia? They want to replace the dollar, and they're making very, very big strides towards achieving that. So what we see is these rates being driven up. The effect of it is that the financial bubble, which really has been building and building and building over the last 4 decades, is over. We're now popping that bubble. The implications for the banking system are extremely important and dire. They're contracting credit now. You can see this in the broad money statistics which cover bank deposits. They're actually contracting credit. And we haven't seen this for, 50, 60 years. This is a very important development. And because interest rates do not yet reflect the true loss of purchasing power of these currencies, you can see that that's got further to go. The bubble is being popped. So what we're now looking at is where do we get out of this bubble? Well, there's an obvious answer. You hoard real money. That's what it's there for. You don't spend it until you need to spend it. It's a superior form of money. Gresham's law applies. But the other thing, as investors, because hoarding money is not investing, that's holding it to spend. But as investors, I think that these evolving conditions are extremely beneficial for the extractive industries around the world. And I don't care whatever the sort of, fossil fuel tax and all the rest of it. It's not us that's driving it. It's the 3.8 billion in Asia. And the people who supply them, a further billion in Africa, and probably a further 500 million elsewhere. We are in a minority in this game, and I think we have to recognize it. Thank you very much indeed.